and see if that kills it. Can you still hear me?
What did you pick for the audio? Computer, right?
Okay. Are we good? You can hear me? No? No?
Now it's back.
There we go. It's strange. I think when I hit record, there's a lag before that cuts out my mic. All right. So how are you two?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little wild out here.
Some big lava plumes in your backyard.
There was a huge one yesterday. Yesterday was kind of a heartbreaker because there's only 2 freshwater lakes, and the lava curved around and then went into the lake, and it drained out this one, or steamed out and filled up this one called Green Lake.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
No more lake.
kind of a bummer. You know, people now, a lot of people, friends are posting photos back when they were at Green Lake or swam in it and stuff like that. So there's this this surprise, because for the most part it was just in Leilani and it was going down, just down the hill, this path of steepest descent, and then it just kind of went this other direction and started going out, and then it got to Four Corners, which is where the 137, 132 cross, and then it came down. Like, it made this huge turn and then started going path of descent again. So, and it's huge. Like, it was a mile wide.
Wow.
A mile wide. Like, it was just trucking like a train.
Holy cow. A mile wide.
Yeah, a mile wide, and just destroying everything in its path.
Wow.
So yesterday was a pretty big day, and then it finally, the front kind of stalled out, I guess they said around 9 o'clock last night. But it was trucking a mile wide and just crushing and destroying everything. But
wow.
Then it slowed down. I guess it hasn't done much since last night, but it certainly wrecked a lot yesterday, including Green Lake, and that's what a lot of people are bumming out about today.
So it just, the entire lake to steam, gone.
Yeah, it just steamed out. So the lava just came around the corner and just poured into it, and then evaporated all the water. Likely filled it all up.
The beard is gone.
I know. My wife had a breakdown when she found out too. Good face.
Yeah.
Who is that young man? Is that baby Todd?
Yeah.
It's funny, when I shave mine off, my wife won't talk to me for a day or two. She does this weird, like, that's just wrong. And then when it gets too long, she gets upset at me as well. So there's a sweet spot in there I haven't quite hit yet, but
yeah.
For
my birthday last year, Brian shaved his off too.
Yeah.
I thought I wanted it, and then I didn't want it. I was like, put it back on.
Like, you just put it back on. It's like, oh, gotta wait like 3-4 weeks for it to fill that in.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. So I've been chugging along on the graphics, quite exhausted by it, considering I used to do this for a living. I didn't realize how much more difficult it is when you're actually invested in it. So I've settled on a very loosey-goosey, non-committal stance, which is a symbol you can add to anything, and variations on it. But I did that because if we value agency and autonomy, that means allowing autonomy within the use of the identity, and also. And I don't know if I've ever expressed this clearly. I don't, like, Jordan Peterson talks about fencing off chaos and maintaining order, and I don't think that that's really what we do. I think what we do is we fence in a type of chaos that's productive, and we fence out a type of chaos that's destructive. So we need to have a lot of degrees of freedom within the fences.
But so you brought up the thing around limits. Like, usually it's not about this. Try to draw these strong lines on things. Is about, well, what is the limit to tolerance? What is the limit to acceptance? You know, whatever the term is, there's still a limit that finds it for it being positive and beneficial, or at a point that it imposes a cost. So
Yeah.
you brought that early.
And I think that if the limits are too constrained, there's no movement, there's no growth, and there's no adaptability. And so I was initially thinking that instead of going from when I was first looking at the dog heads, it was like one image for us all. And then I switched to the idea of the symbol with the SN that could be attached to any image. It was about opening it up so that there is adaptability and there is freedom of expression within it.
Not right now.
And then when I hit on that,
Okay.
So you'd have the freedom of expression within that. Then I had to address the fact that we have guys like Jay Fitzgerald, which is on the left. We've got guys that are neo-reactionary and probably pretty fashy on the right. And then there's a broad range between us. But we obviously share the same sentiment, and we have to accommodate all of that. So I didn't want to block us into any one sort of aesthetic that implies a particular position. So then the symbol opens up to a freedom of expression as well. So that's the decision that I've made, sort of as the judge of last resort. That's what we'll do. So now all I'm going to do is define the limits. You can do everything within this. You can't step outside these bounds, and obviously that's going to be things like no imposing costs on anybody else, no imposing costs on the identity, invest in the property, that sort of thing. So it'll be very short with some examples of it, and I'll put the assets that I've created, all of them, the dog heads, the symbols, all of them, up in a form where people can grab them down and use them however they like. And then I think what we can do is each of us can form our own identity within the walled garden, so to speak. I just didn't have a chance to finish it today. But that's where I am with that. So that will probably be next weekend. I'll upload a document on brand guidelines, upload assets. And then the last thing, which is what I should probably open up to a conversation with all of you, is for there to be limits, there needs to be teeth to enforce it. And the one thing that I haven't talked or haven't really concluded on yet is, are we going to be preemptive or reactionary? So negativa would say it would be reactionary, but I think preemptive protects the property. So that's just to say that if you use the symbol, you kind of have to run it past the community before you launch it. That we all kind of have a say. I don't want something floating out there that nobody knows about, and then all of a sudden, we're on the news as a neo-Nazi symbol or something like that. Right. So,
sorry guys, I got to drop off.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can come back for the other call.
Okay, no problem. So that's just where I'm at, where if it's preemptive, then we're back into a positiva sort of restrictions as opposed to reactive, which is negativa, and I haven't decided what's the best yet.
Well, I'll give you an example from cars. My buddy Brian talks about how you can do preventative maintenance or you do repairs.
Right.
So it's similar, but it's also not an either or. Obviously, there's certain things we do that are preventative, oil changes, filters, things like that. So you may define what things are preventative, routine type of stuff, and then what would be repairs, and maybe what areas to kind of check that might fail. I think that's another thing to go for. And if that within the limits that we're talking about, limits of use, stuff like that, where would we typically see breaking points and problems as best we can, and then what would be the routine maintenance. And I like the creative aspect and people able to remix and come up with ideas. That's pretty exciting, and I think that's way more community building, and it really fills what the younger generation is already doing. They're already remixing songs, they're remixing videos, they're cutting and clipping things and creating their own either documentaries or their own blurbs on stuff. So that's already happening.
Yeah, and I like the idea that that if we're heading in positive chaos, then there's going to be bifurcations. And there's already seeds of some bifurcations within the community that some might take it off in one direction, others in another, that it doesn't have to be a strictly cohesive whole, that we can have separate communities that still fall under an umbrella. And I'd rather define an umbrella, or like you say, a walled garden, rather than a very strict community. So,
Right.
So that's the damages becomes the issue, is enough of a clear enough preemptive definition as to what's acceptable kind of gives us a preventative measure. The issue is if there are damages that happen to occur that we have to address after the fact, we have no teeth. We have no teeth because we're not a legal entity. We have no teeth because we don't have any legal agreements with people. So we almost have to have a culture and an honor around it well established, because reactive measures are not going to be very effective.
Yeah, I mean, and not really sharp teeth. Well, for that walled garden, I would look towards the distribution in that 4% of 4%, right?
Right.
And so be extra cautious of and extra supportive of that top 4% that are going to be the most beneficial with sheepdog democracy in all ways, in the positive growth and networking, and then just be really, really careful with that negative 4%, even watching for that first 1% that grabs it and it goes off, and starts to become, what is it, an intolerant minority within it, and
yeah, it's just that we have no way right now of prosecuting, which then goes on to the next thing, is that I'm looking at the logistics of not-for-profit organizations here in Canada. There might be introducing a new model called a hybrid model, which is a hybrid between profit and not-for-profit. Don't like the idea of cooperative. It demands a certain degree of participation by everybody, and obviously a full-on charity is out of the question. So I'd prefer to keep it out of legal entities right now and then have it community enforced. And then from there, when there are bifurcations and are set communities emerging, then you could look at legalizing entities by our regions. So some of the things that I'm looking at here locally is facilitating internships and apprenticeships with trades within Eastern Toronto. So I might create a not-for-profit that does that, and that is not, there's not really a whole lot of financial exchange, but it gives corporate identity and an umbrella in which I can approach employers and hook them up with trade schools, and also inject sort of a gentlemanly education to these interns. So that'll probably be my first community project that I look at. And then I'm sure everybody else has their own ideas locally that they can pursue as well.
Is there a reason why you don't want to make it a for-profit?
A for-profit itself, just incorporate it, make it a for-profit. There wouldn't be anything that would be geared to profit itself. So one of the issues with for-profit, if it's not a sole proprietorship, is the responsibility of shareholders to turn a profit. So if I keep it as a sole proprietorship, then it is only ever me, and it never scales out to a community. If it scales out to a community, then shareholders are involved, and then it has to be profit driven, which then reduces the social or community projects that we can do. Then in all of these cases, this is almost why I'm leaning away from any legal entity around it, is because of these legal definitions. The only incentive for a legal corporate entity is that it gives us legal teeth. It gives us a recognized identity within the law that can then write and commit to contracts and take people to court under that umbrella, as opposed to it being across individuals. The one thing that I haven't looked at is how do lodges organize themselves, and are they functioning across the totality of their organization as a legal entity, or is it just subsets within them that they have their own charities and so on that fall under the umbrella of the lodge? But I really don't have anybody I can draw from that knows the sort of the logistics around running lodges and so on. But those are some of the things that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at things that are more formally structured than a bunch of guys on Facebook.
Right.
So.
All right. What else do you want to cover today?
The one concern that I have running through my head is my stance on agency. I want to make sure that we can argue it effectively. So the deviation between Kurt and I, and it was right at the beginning of my article on Sheepdog, was rolling agency as a commodity or approaching agency as a property. That agency is a subset of property as opposed to property being an expression of agency. That's really where we differ.
Mm-hmm.
And then that rolled out some other differences too, because he was talking about asymptotes. I'm not sure if you guys know what asymptotes are.
Yep.
Asymptote is obviously Morris would. An asymptote is I think it's mathematical. It occurs in science anyways, where you have
infinitely approaching curve.
Yeah, an approach that infinitely approaches but never reaches a limit. So you could say that you have a curve that approaches zero but never reaches zero. Or approaches infinity but never reaches infinity. And so what I've found out in conversations with Kurt is that his notion of truth is still a correspondence theory of truth, in that truthful speech is an asymptote that can never but always approaches perfect correspondence. And that his notion of agency is the same way. There is no perfect agency, but it's an asymptote that is continuously approaching perfect agency. And I disagree with that, because I think a limit that's never reached is not a limit, and it's not an operational limit. So I break the two out to say that agency is a biological function and a legal axiom, meaning that everybody is an actor and responsible for their actions, regardless of the determinism behind those actions, and that autonomy is then agency. Is the application of agency to greater degrees of deliberation. And the reason why I say that is that agency biologically can't be decoupled from the structure in which it develops. So in sociology, they talk about you're an agent, you have free will, but that free will happens within a social structure. And the degree in which you're an agent is the degree in which you're out of the influence of that structure. So that, to me, paints a false dichotomy, because agency can't exist without the structure in which it evolves out of, and will always, to some degree, be a reflection of the structure that it's within. The obvious example of that is language, is that human cognition operates within language, so it's always subjected to the limitations within language. Therefore, agency, human agency, intellectual agency is restricted by language. I think the notion of separating agency and structure is a false notion, that it's a cybernetic reflexive system, and that autonomy really pertains to other agents. It's not the dichotomy from agency to structure, but your agency expressed in relation to limitations by other actors.
As in a relative degree of independence from others.
Right. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah, yes, of course, my agency is limited by structure, because my agency is defined by structure.
But also enabled by structure.
Yeah, and enabled by structure, and that's why
I
separate.
Basically, what you're talking about is what in GA we would call a disciplinary space, as in, like, we exist within a structure that has created the language, that has created the tools, the customs, the norms, the habits, all of those things. Over time, you can't extricate yourself from that and still function the way that it does. and so you sort of owe your agency to that. So yeah, you're touching on a very good number of subjects there.
Yeah, and I think that the notion of transcending structure to be a completely free agent is to deny that structure is a necessity for agency to exist.
Yeah, that's a bullshit thing. Yeah.
Yeah. The notion of deciding a person's degree of agency measured by the degree at which it's independent from structure is a false notion. That really, if you're going to do that, if you're going to assess a person's agency by the limitations of structure, what you're really measuring is the total nonlinear interactions between structure and agency itself. So you're actually not measuring the individual, you're measuring the relationship between the individual and the society.
It sort of goes into the territory of where, like, it doesn't really matter what IQ you have, but what IQ your society has.
Yeah, and then so that when if we're looking at an average IQ within a society, is that an indication of the weakness of the individuals, or is it a weakness of the society itself? And it's both, and it's all, it always is both.
Yeah, I mean, more in general, that if you have more IQ, then generally you're going to be living a better life. It doesn't translate directly to the agency question, but I thought it's sort of analogous. I know that Brian was going to say something, but I'm just going to add one more comment. It seems what you're saying, or we're talking about, is also related to this notion of self-criticality, as in a system being able to organize it fluidly between chaos and sort of rapidly restructuring itself when the particular structure that has built up no longer corresponds to the conditions it finds itself in, which is sort of what happens, or what seems to happen, which is currently what a friend of mine is researching in psychedelics, what seems to be happening with psychedelics, that they basically force you closer to chaos, and then when you come off them, you sort of arrive at a restructured state that has gone through self-criticality and allows you to better, to basically free up energy by abolishing loops that are not serve a purpose but that are draining energy, and then suddenly you have more energy available to approach your life with more integrity.
Yeah, and the notion there is the more malleable the structure is, the greater adaptability is available, and then really the gauge in whether something is effective or not in terms of that agency structure dichotomy is whether the restructure, after blowing apart the structure, when it restructures, is it able to accommodate more information with less energy, as opposed to a smaller structure that is now having to hold information out or drains energy towards maintaining its structure. Okay, so I think that, Moritz, you've hit on what I'm getting at, is that we can't find a means of measurability or calculability by a dichotomy of agency and structure. So really, what is it that we're looking at when we talk about agency in toto? We're talking about two agents opposed to each other. So then that's one agent working against the autonomy of the other, and vice versa, or against the structure itself that's there to cultivate agency within the individuals.
Bill,
And then, go ahead.
Bill, I was gonna, before we get too far along, you may want to point out why this distinction in the difference where you have a differing opinion or perspective from Kurt is important.
Yeah.
Primacy of property, you have forwarded the primacy of agency, but you haven't made the clarification, especially for viewers, anybody else who comes across this video. Why is that an important distinction for some?
Okay, and there's two sides to it. One is that I am unclear as to why I'm making that distinction, if that's just based on personal bias or not. Essentially what I'm saying is that the more I explore this, the more it confirms a bias that I have. So I'm opening the conversation to other people to say, yes or no, this is your bias, or the bias is valid. The second one is that the primacy of agency...
Sounds like you're... Go ahead.
that the primacy of agency over primacy of property has a pragmatic function in terms of governance and the relationship between individuals and society, which then again means that I'm being driven by data outside of the concept itself, which is again why I can't verify whether it's a bias or not. So I'll clarify that. Primacy of agency naturally leads to conclusions around limitation of governance over the individual. Provides measurability of the commons and decidability on what commons creation is valid or not, in a way of gauging its value on a scale. Where property, primacy of property, allows us to define the limitations on agency in an arbitrary manner, where you could say, for instance, any person under the IQ of 90 is not a human being, or that women have no agency. These are all I see as ramifications of the primacy of property. You can now mess around with the definition of agency to exclude consideration of what are agents, whether that agency is intentional or not. So what primacy of agency affords is the argumentation of the middle to the upper to say this is why you need to have constraints, even though we may not have the power to prevent them from not using those restraints. It also affords us the protections from the lower imposing upon the middle. Whereas the primacy of property is almost exclusively a protection of the top.
Right.
Whoever has the property is the one that's looking to protect the property. We have agency, or we have volition, and we're looking for protection of that volition. So these are my two concerns, because so far I haven't seen flaws in my definition of agency in toto. My concern is what is driving me towards the importance of it has nothing to do with agency itself, which then tells me that that's driven by bias. So that's why I wanted to open it up to everybody else.
Is there a possibility where Kurt had shared the three ranges, like you want to be a military dictator in times of war, you want to have centralization. When you're in the time of peace and prosperity, you want to have the most open, free markets. The markets are deciding everything. And then when you have an abundance in things, you want kind of a socialistic, redistributive aspect. So is there something where property, which I would agree, tends to be aligns with a capitalistic, I own the property, it's like it's the rich man's, the capital, the power.
Depends what type of property we're talking about.
I get that, but in general, I'm saying it seems like propertarianism would support the aristocracy, which there are some good arguments behind intergenerational transfers and some of the ramifications. Bill, from what I could tell, is all about that the middle class is the volitional power of our experience, and therefore we get to define the way that it all works, and we're going to set limits, and so we reestablish the middle. I think there's a tremendous strength in that argument. Both the upper and the middle class, if you don't check the underclass, so to speak, could be IQ, it's property, it's basically doing a lot of unconscious actions which or attacks the commons, or free ride, parasite, predate, these type of things. I don't necessarily hear where is it's not just a social safety net. It's like the upper class has figured out a model, propertarian, and we're kind of doing the sheepdog thing, which can support the middle class. We haven't necessarily framed a good ideological box, and so if it's property, agency, and maybe something else, which would be, and maybe it is the autonomy. Maybe that's the one that I know that the primacy of autonomy kind of shows up. Maybe that's where it is, but that's where I would look, is that maybe there is a dynamic, and that, yeah, of course, if you're an aristocrat, you're going to be looking at propertarianism and protecting your property and protecting your intergenerational transfer, hopefully by beneficial and benevolent means. That's important. And for the middle class that has been rot and destroyed and parasited and predated, we're obviously doing almost like a phoenix. We're coming back to life and saying, hey, enough is enough. We've got new boundaries and limits. And those aristocrats that have whatever, we acknowledge you, we support you for being good stewards. You get to keep your lion's share, whatever. Yay, property. Here's our agency. And then, so anyway, that's what I'm just chiming into. And maybe when you're seeing not necessarily a bias, but questioning it, it could be from that larger ideological framework, and that they do work together and they work better in times of war, times of peace, and times of prosperity.
Yeah, because the one thing that I know, if we were to switch up political systems, depending on the situation, like you say, the gauge to that, to me, has to be a gauge on the investment and protection of commons. Now, we can approach that as a property, which we do, or the value of that property based on the agency that it cultivates in the polis. So if we're at war, there should be an acceptance of limitation on limits, and move towards more of a totalitarian role in an attempt to protect the conditions that we need to develop agency temporarily. So I think that both agency-en-toto and property-en-toto can accommodate that shift. I think where it really comes down to is how we address the bottom and the impositions on the bottom. Is that agency-en-toto would demand that there would have to be a demonstrated lack of agency before we impose a limitation, where property-en-toto allows you to define agency preemptively preventing acts of those agency. So you could define a bottom limit on keyword social economic class or education or anything like that, and say anybody below this just simply is not allowed to participate in markets or in the public sphere. Or we can't. We have to let them act, and based on their actions, then we clamp down. So I think that potentially this might be why Kurt sticks with the one definition of agency, where I break it out into agency and autonomy. We have 10 minutes before I have to start and stop again.
Yep.
And that's actually the same risk that we were just talking about with the brand. Is that preemptive securing of damages or prevention of damages versus the allowing the damages and then reacting to it. So go ahead, Moritz.
I was just saying that my battery's about to die, so I'll drop off now, and then we can maybe have another call start up, and then I'll join.
Okay.
But I have lots of points to this.
Okay, so what I'll do is on the Facebook page, when we restart, I'll repost it. So keep an eye on that, and the link will be there. Okay. Anyways, big topics.
Do you feel there's a third? That's what I was poking around at.
Well,
There's a third, because otherwise it's almost like what came first, property or agency, and they kind of fuel each other, because if you have agency, you want more property to protect, and if you have more property, you're going to need more agency to do all the things you need to do.
I think the third distinction is autonomy. And I think that the property, it is not possible to create property without agency, because we define property by investment to the degree in which we would defend. That is an act of agency. So agency must precede property. Agency is what allows property to exist. Property is an expression of agency. And then agency-en-toto, property is invested agency in the past. It's stored up agency. The protection then against, the upper is looking for protection of property. The middle is looking for a protection for autonomy. I think the lower is looking for a protection of agency, which is don't mistreat us. They have some degree to seek their life, even though their lives might be somewhat detrimental. Respect for life, essentially. And there's very little distinction between agency and life, and if with a low bar definition of agency. So I think we do cover off the three classes in that we are afforded measurement and calculability in dealing with conflicts and damages across the three. And I think that we can adequately argue that property is a derivative of agency as opposed to a type of commodity, agency being a type of commodity. But the argument against it is that I am making a definition without a distinction. I'm making up a distinction that that allows me to define agency as just purely biological ability to have an effect, and then autonomy as a separate definition. And I have to admit that the definition is coming from outside of the operational bounds of those definitions. It's coming from a legal frame. So then the next point is, do we need to consider anything outside of that legal frame if all we're talking about is social systems? So there's Moritz is hooked up again, and yeah.
6 minutes.
It's at 6 minutes. Yeah, I don't have a time up here, so. Okay.
We got one here. How about a quick, has anyone defined or given limits to what upper, middle, and lower class would be?
I have it in my head. I've alluded to it in a few writings. I think that the point at which, so I have defined these things based on the degree at which you live by your own decisions. So if you spend your day working for a boss, the majority of your day is dictated by the decisions of somebody else. If you've reached a degree of self-reliance or independence, the majority of your day, your life, is an expression of your own decisions. That's a sort of middle range. And the degree at which your decisions then trickle out and dictate the activity of other people would put you in the upper. So if you're a boss with 200 employees or 20 employees, you're part of that upper class because your agency is now extending beyond the confines of your own life. It's trickling out and affecting others. If you're able to maintain autonomy within your own life, you're in the middle, and the degree at which your life is dictated by others would then define the working and lower. I think that that is a good measurement because when we look to leaders in making decisions across a community, we want people that have experience with decisions that extend beyond their own sort of sphere. So that would give us a breakout of class and responsibilities by what people have demonstrated within their own lives, as opposed to an approval by a peerage or some sort of gatekeeping within the legal system. Yeah. And then, so that then ties back to autonomy again, the depth of autonomy a person has.
Reasonably apart from.
Well, it's an interesting clarification for the class system instead of, I think, a default would be more like economic, socioeconomic status tends to define class. But to make it about decision, kind of where are you on the decision tree, is an interesting and I think a more egalitarian way to look at it.
Yeah, without it being an enforced equality. So if you're on a farm self-reliant, you've reached a point of independence where you're not beholden to anybody else's choices. You would hold the same status as, say, a personal contractor or a business owner that's able to maintain their own income without debt and without the reliance on an authority within their own lives. But then that ties over to, say, if you're an executive in a large corporation, you may not own that corporation, you may have a boss, but your decisions affect hundreds of people. It allows us to measure those three across and say that there is overlap here in terms of responsibility and consequences that we can trust has molded a person towards better decisions or capable of holding more responsibility. So that then we're crossing that it's not only economics. We can say a person in a military officer fits in that scale as well. They may have an officer above them, but their decisions are extending out to many people below them. That affords a certain position in that spectrum. So now we have commensurability across the social spheres, whether that's sort of not-for-profit or commons creation to economics to militia. We're able to measure across those things and then afford recognized and rewarded paths within those spheres within society. Because right now we reward economics very easily. There are people that may not be driven by those incentives. They may want to create co-ops or help the impoverished. We don't really reward that. So that has to be something that they do outside of earning their living. And then we have the military on another branch that isn't really even considered part of our social sphere. So I think this allows commensurability across all of those, which then provide incentives within each of those spheres, all of them being necessary for a community and a commons. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that is captured by property alone, unless you, and what Kurt has done is unless you roll autonomy or agency as a property, and then you choose to use that particular property as a means of measurement. And for me, that's a discretionary stance as opposed to a necessary stance based on the philosophy or the operations involved.
I think the decision tree leads to judge of last resort, and it also dovetails nicely into, am I imposing cost on others? You know, so it tends to give that line of where you can start to get real clear on, am I imposing cost on others? And then at what point, who's the judge of last resort? So it kind of points to that same nervous system of decision trees. So that's great. I think you might want to pause and carry on.
Yeah, and that judge of last resort was where that and the notion of no special rights was where I came